Hello everyone, Taxman here with another special episode of the Six-Sided Podcast. And tonight we're going to be doing a dive into the, we'll say, response that Anthem Sports and Entertainment issued towards Jeff Jarrett's lawsuit. Now, this came down in court on November the 1st. So it was essentially Impact filing motions with the United States District Court of Tennessee to essentially have the lawsuit, frivolous as it may be, lawsuit that was filed by Jeff Jarrett summarily dismissed. Now, for those who don't know, a few months ago, Jeff Jarrett launched a lawsuit against Impact Wrestling. That would be the owners, Anthem Sports and Entertainment, essentially alleging that they misused the properties of GFW, Global Force Wrestling, in their promotion. Also that they misappropriated the library tapes of GFW Amped, and that they were supposedly making money over fist on these GFW Amped series tapes, which in this program you will find out clearly is not the case. But I digress a little bit. So while I'm getting into this, it may be a little bit confusing, so I'm going to try and surmise it first off for everybody to kind of grasp, because I may be jumping back and forth between the two entities, and I don't want anybody to get confused. So the original lawsuit is actually against the defending Anthem Sports and Entertainment Corporation, which is separate from Anthem Wrestling's Exhibitions, LLC, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense right at this very second if you're not used to or not familiar with how everything's been going in this ongoing saga, but it'll be further explained as we proceed in this program tonight. Now, essentially on November 1st, Anthem Sports and Entertainment and Anthem Wrestling Exhibitions LLC, I should say, essentially requested that this whole case be dismissed, and stated several reasons why, which I'm going to get into, starting with the first reason, which is the biggest one in my opinion. Now, when Jeff Jarrett had filed his lawsuit, he filed it under the pretense that his material of GFW Amped, I'm using in a loose quotation mark, was copyrighted. Actually was completely not the case. He filed the lawsuit, believe this or not, although if you know Jeff Jarrett, I guess it's easy to believe. He filed the lawsuit before he actually copyrighted his own material, which is obviously a little bit of putting the carriage before the horse, if you will. So if you'll remember, when this whole thing started, Jeff Jarrett immediately demanded that the GFW Amped library be handed over immediately to Jeff Jarrett. That's because he didn't have any of the master copies. They weren't copywritten. They were actually property in part to Impact Wrestling LLC. I'm going to get into why that is in just a second as well. But among the other reasons that Anthem Sports and Entertainment and Anthem Wrestling LLC wanted the suit dismissed was in regards to Jeff Jarrett's allegations that the defendants, quote-unquote, violated Jeff Jarrett's exclusive property rights to his own name, photograph, or other likeness. Now, what's funny about that is that Anthem Sports Entertainment actually produced documents, whereas Jeff Jarrett, the name Jeff Jarrett, had consented to allow TNA Entertainment back in 2004 full exclusive rights to that name. So, in essence, when Impact Sports Entertainment, Impact Wrestling, the entity we know right now, purchased the company, they purchased all previous rights to the company, which includes the rights, as you may as well guess right now, to the name Jeff Jarrett. And actually, it was Mike Johnson from PW Insider that actually obtained a copy of the actual form itself, where it states, I, Jeff Jarrett, hereby give consent to the registration and trademark Jeff Jarrett, there's a serial number, for costumes, namely wrestling costumes and masks for children and teenagers, toy action figures and accessories thereof, entertainment services, named wrestling exhibits and performances by an individual professional wrestler and entertainer, providing wrestling news and information via a global computer network. So the fact that he filed this lawsuit claiming that they were using his likeness, name, image, etc. without permission is actually completely false and fabricated. He gave his expressed written consent. This would have been back in 2006, actually January 19th of 2006. So just to further back this up, Anthem also submitted copies of different trademark transfers of several copyrights that they procured through the purchase of TNA Wrestling in itself. And it, obviously with that Impact Wrestling, they're just trying to further their case essentially of like, okay, it's not only that we bought Jeff Jarrett's likeness and use of photography and use of his exhibitional work with the company. Here's all of our other ones that we've also procured, which is really smart if you think about it, because now this is going to prevent anybody from filing a similar lawsuit to what Jeff Jarrett is doing now, because now it's out in the open that, hey, we have this, it's all legal, y'all signed it, and I think it's going to save them a lot of headache, hassle, and etc. in the long run of anybody who thinks they may be able to try and make a quick dollar off of Impact Wrestling, such as obviously Jeff Jarrett tried here. So one of the other claims that Jeff Jarrett had was that Anthem, etc. had violated state and federal trademark infringements in relation to Global Force Entertainment, which is funny because Anthem's motion and the motion to which Jeff Jarrett sued them with clearly states Global Force Wrestling, with the whole GFW initials and everything. So that was dated March 9th of this year and signed by Jeff Jarrett himself, featuring himself in front of the GFW logo. Once again, he didn't even file his possible copyright infringement materials or otherwise properly, because he's claiming that he's filing under GFE. Everything clearly is stated GFW, so he's actually suing on behalf of GFE, which didn't exist in terms of these court documents. You could just tell that he really was just trying to pull a scam on this one, and we're going to get further into that as we go here. Now, what's also funny is that the featured photo that he used in this lawsuit, with the GFW logo, letters, and all of that, was actually also the cover art for the Impact Wrestling DVD release of the GFW Amped series. That was, in his eyes, to substantiate his claim that Global Force Wrestling was entitled to the registration for use on DVD. So, essentially, what Anthem is boiling this all down to is that Jeff Jarrett himself already provided proof that Impact had permission, full permission, to utilize the logo and name, because he himself was using that usage to promote GFW, which in turn was promoting Impact Wrestling, who at the time, if you'll remember, he was working for as a figurehead. Now, one of the other motions that was filed by Anthem was explaining that the court essentially lacked jurisdiction over the, we'll say, different companies related to Impact Wrestling. So Anthem Sports breaks down the different companies that it falls under. That Anthem Sports itself is a Canadian holding company that has no day-to-day operations other than the ownership of several subsidiaries that host the various Anthem brands. Its primary place of business is in Toronto, Canada, and that it does not do business at all in the state of Tennessee, and that all content distributed by Anthem entities is held by Anthem Sports, and they are done so through related companies or third-party licensing agreements. So essentially what they're saying is that Jarrett is the plaintiff himself, that he cannot possibly allege facts sufficient to establish that this court can assert personal jurisdiction over Anthem Sports in a manner that is consistent with the due process clause. Now, what this essentially means is, because Anthem Sports is made up of several, we'll call them subsidiaries, none of which are based in Tennessee, which was where this lawsuit was filed, that a Tennessee court is ill-equipped to find any finding at all, period, in this case, and that it should be dismissed summarily. And we further break down notes on Anthem Sports. So, Anthem Sports and Anthem Wrestling are two separate and distinct legal entities, and all appropriate corporate formalities have been observed. Although Anthem Wrestling, see, this is where it gets a little bit confusing, but I'm going to go with it here. Although Anthem Wrestling is controlled by Fight Media, Anthem Wrestling has different shareholders than Anthem Sports, and Anthem Wrestling is funded by financing facilities separate from the financing facilities for Anthem Sports. So what it's essentially going over here is that Anthem Sports and Anthem Wrestling are two separate entities with two separate billing locations, two separate places of businesses, two separate companies in their own entity, both of which are located out of the jurisdiction of Tennessee as well, obviously. And that neither of which completely controls the day-to-day operations of the other company. So when you're suing just Anthem Wrestling, there is not just an Anthem Wrestling. Right, there's Anthem Sports, and there's Anthem Sports and Entertainment, and then you understand where I'm getting at, right? There's not just one corporation that he would have been trying to sell, but once again, putting the carriage before the horse, he didn't obviously look into any of this beforehand. So of note, it's also interesting to note that Anthem Sports also said, or brought to the attention of the courts, that Jeff Jarrett signed a non-disclosure agreement with the company during the time that he was coming to work for them as CCO, that's Chief Creative Officer. Anthem insisted upon and received a clause that states that any issues that arose legally would fall under New York law, noting that even if one plaintiff or plaintiffs allegation that their claims do not relate to or arise from this non-disclosure agreement, as one is required to do at this juncture of the proceedings, these allegations actually establish that Anthem Sports deliberately did not avail itself of doing business in the forum. So essentially what they've done with this non-disclosure agreement as Anthem Sports in itself is essentially been able to be not sued in Tennessee. Any lawsuit filed against them would have to be filed in New York. So once again, this kind of goes to the whole basis that this entire thing should be thrown out, because Jeff Jarrett himself signed this non-disclosure agreement, and in doing so signed the agreement that if he was ever going to file a lawsuit with or against, you could say, Anthem Sports Entertainment, Impact Wrestling, whatever you want to call it, all of the facets of the company, that he couldn't do so in his home state of Tennessee. He would have had to travel to New York, which he would have known because he signed the goddamn paper. Ridiculous. Now, what's also very interesting is that, remember when Jeff Jarrett was there and all of his, we'll say, personal issues came to light, and he was relieved of his duties with Impact Wrestling, and then you'll note right after that the whole GFW Impact Wrestling merger was nullified essentially. So Anthem essentially gave their side to the story on this one, and I'm going to read a direct quote from that. Jeff Jarrett entered into discussions wherein Jarrett's company would merge into Anthem Wrestling in exchange for an officer-level position with a large salary, a job for Jarrett's wife, and an equity interest in Anthem Wrestling. The plan was to use Jarrett and his extensive experience in the wrestling business to help grow and differentiate the Impact Wrestling brand that Anthem had recently acquired. Jarrett would bring to the deal his Global Force Wrestling and GFW brands and 16 episodes of wrestling content, which was the GFW Amped content that he had produced some 2 years earlier, but thus far had been unable to monetize. The parties planned to complete and finalize the Amped content, added voiceover, and perform the other necessary post-productive work in order to get in shape to broadcast and sell. In order to carry out these plans, Jeff Jarrett was made CCO of Anthem Wrestling effective of April of 2017 and given complete authority over its wrestling operations and the content that the company would create, market, and sell. It continues, under Mr. Jarrett's watch as CCO, the the amped content was packaged as 5 different pay-per-view broadcasts and was marketed with both the GFW and Impact trademarks. The amped content was also packaged as DVDs and sold online. Also, during Mr. Jarrett's tenure with Anthem Wrestling as their CCO, the company decided to use the phrase Global Wrestling Network as a descriptor for an over-the-top or an OTT application developed by Anthem Wrestling upon which wrestling content would be marketed. Now, obviously, we all know this as the GWN app that is heavily, we'll say, promoted, if you will, during Impact Wrestling broadcasts. And it continues, as often happens, the parties' merger did not work out as expected. Mr. Jarrett was terminated near the end of October 2017. The sale and marketing of the amped content was not successful, and here's the important part, did not turn a profit. So again, goes to one of the suits that Jeff Jarrett alleged that Anthem, Impact Wrestling, the company itself, made an exorbitant amount of money off of his likeness and usage of the GFW amped tape library. Now, it's been shown in court that none of it turned a profit. So, once again, one of these baseless accusations from an ill-thought-out lawsuit, essentially. But it gets better. So, essentially, all of Jeff Jarrett's allegations and claims against Anthem, Impact Wrestling, the lawsuit, they're just naming this in general, so that they all arise out of the same conduct. Anthem Wrestling's broadcast and sale of the amped content using both parties' trademarks pursuant to the failed merger. So, this is the funny part. Remarkably, Mr. Jarrett is suing over the very conduct that he oversaw and conducted as an officer of Anthem Wrestling. So, essentially, what this boils down to is Jeff Jarrett, if you want to boil this all down to one simple, succinct phrase, Jeff Jarrett is suing Impact Wrestling for Jeff Jarrett doing Jeff Jarrett's job at Impact Wrestling. That's the funniest part of this whole supposition that was released on November 1st in these court filings. You want to talk about a carny, and you wonder why people talk about Jeff Jarrett as a carny? Here you go, and the proof is in the pudding. There's not much else you can say about it. Now, some of this goes into the, we'll say, past, although it's very recent, of how Impact itself, both Anthem Sports and Impact Wrestling, came to bring Jeff Jarrett on as his creative, or as the CCO officer for Impact Wrestling. So, Anthem noted that they began speaking to Jeff Jarrett in October of 2016, which is before they officially took the company over from Dixie Carter's Impact Ventures LLC. Regarding his employment in the company, Jarrett and Anthem Wrestling signed a term sheet in May of 2017. Anthem's joint filing notes that the term sheet provided Jeff Jarrett as Chief Creative Officer, that Jeff Jarrett was responsible for all wrestling operations of the company and would have overall responsibility and full authority for ensuring timely and efficient production and programming to meet the company's obligations under its distribution agreements to produce content for television broadcast and pay-per-view airings, content for the company's digital distribution channels, which would be the GWN, and performance of live events. So essentially, Mr. Jarrett was going to be an Anthem Wrestling employee in charge of all of the content that Impact Wrestling would be selling. Now, obviously they could have buried Jeff Jarrett here in the court filings of how he was released from the company. They didn't. They just left a short note about that. They just said it became clear that the merger was not going to work, and for various reasons, Mr. Jarrett was terminated as Anthem Wrestling's Chief Creative Officer at the end of October 2017. So even though this whole court thing is going to be obviously bitter and drawn out, assuming that, or that would be under the assumption, I should say, that this thing is not thrown out entirely right away, but they could have shredded this guy over what has become public knowledge of why he was summarily let go of the company, and they didn't. So to me, that's just a classy move on their part. So Anthem also noted that all of GFW's pay-per-views aired during Jarrett's time as CCO of the company, with the exception of one, which was in December of 2017, and that any trademark violations alleged over the usage of GFW Anthem or AMPed materials should be tossed out because Anthem had implied license to use the material from Jarrett and GWEF, whatever he wanted to call it, via his employment as an officer for the company. So essentially, because he was paid to produce all this programming, so that would have been every pay-per-view that Anthem or that Impact Wrestling ran from that 2017 era until Jeff Jarrett was let go. That's all property of Impact Wrestling because he was hired to produce that content. Also, as well, with his GFW Amped series, he signed that over as content to be produced by Impact Wrestling for Impact Wrestling's expressed purposeful distribution. So once again, Jeff Jarrett is suing Impact Wrestling for hiring Jeff Jarrett to be Jeff Jarrett and do jobs related to Jeff Jarrett. It's so funny. And all of this kind of gets summarized in a joint motion where Anthem notes that under these circumstances, there can be no doubt that Jarrett provided the content at the request of the defendant, Anthem Wrestling, and that he intended that Anthem Wrestling use and distribute the content using Jarrett's own trademarks. Moreover, because Jeff Jarrett granted this license in exchange for his salary and the promise of the anticipated merger, it is supported by consideration and is irrevocable, which means that just because they fired him doesn't mean he can do the whole takesy-backsies thing. He signed it all over. It's no longer his property, which I mentioned this at the start of it. He didn't even have access to the master tapes from the GFW Amped series because he had signed them over as part of his agreement to work for the company as the chief officer, and as well all the perks aforementioned that came with it. So you really start to see in the whole course of this thing, Jeff Jarrett's case just like unravel more and more and more. We started out with a big bowl of wool. We're getting down to strings here, and it only gets better. So I mentioned earlier that when Jarrett had filed his lawsuit that he had used the GFW Amped photographs and like as proof, which also obviously showed Impact Wrestling's trademark, which they get into here. This is the very same content and very same airing, that would be August 11th of 2007, of it that Mr. Jarrett claims in this action is copyright and trademark infringement committed by Anthem Wrestling. Yet, under penalty of perjury, he swore that this very same use was to be used to the insured to his benefit. So in other words, used by the licensee, that would be Impact Wrestling. So that this SOU is a sworn admission that the defendant, Anthem Wrestling's alleged use of the GFW Amped content and GFW trademarks is a valid license. Now, once again, this is just all going... I know it's a lot of legal mumbo-jumbo for a lot of people, and myself included. I'm not a lawyer by any stretch of the imagination. However, this further points to the fact, like, essentially what they're doing here is just hammering home the fact that they, Impact Wrestling, are expressly permitted by Jeff Jarrett himself through all of these sworn affidavits, through all of these non-disclosure pages and articles that he signed, through all of these licenses that he's granted to Impact Wrestling, whether it's Anthem now or TNA before, it doesn't matter. Anthem owns it all. They're just hammering home this point as we move along in this case. Now, in the midst of all of this was a super interesting piece of business that came out of it, was how Anthem Wrestling, or Anthem Sports and Anthem Wrestling, eventually came to purchase Impact Wrestling from Dixie Carter. So, essentially, Anthem Wrestling was formed in order to acquire the assets of an entity called TNA Entertainment LLC when Fight Media foreclosed on certain loans to that entity. So, essentially, it's revealed that when Billy Corgan stopped funding Impact Wrestling, that was back in October of 2016, The working capital loan to fund the operations of TNA Impact Wrestling by Anthem Sports and Entertainment Corporation, which was described as a credit relationship, ended up being a loan that was payable to Impact Wrestling, which was at the time headed by Dixie Carter. They were unable to repay it, which led to Anthem foreclosing on the loan, therefore acquiring control and ownership of the company in the process. Which is interesting that given the timeline of when Jarrett was hired by Anthem Sports or Anthem Wrestling, or both entities, essentially it shows that Anthem was kind of plotting this whole takeover of TNA Impact at the time of hiring Jeff Jarrett. Which makes sense, because why would you loan out a substantially large amount of money to a company that has been essentially floundering for years and years and years, but is a large content producer for your channel programming? Obviously, that would be Fight Network is the major one in Canada, plus all their subsidiaries worldwide. So rather than let this company just go by the wayside and belly up, it makes sense that you would finance it in the hopes that, or in the realization, not really hopes, that there's no way that they're going to be able to repay this loan. Once they can't, you foreclose it, you buy the company flat out. Now you own this company that's providing content for your various platforms. It's a big win for yourself, and it's a great business strategy. Obviously, if you have your own programming on your own channel, now you're making money off of all facets of it. So that would be marketing, merchandise, TV commercials, etc., etc., etc. So it makes sense that a media conglomerate company would want, full control and access to and care of, especially live or produced content such as Impact Wrestling. It's a win, a big win for Impact, how they essentially came to procure Impact Wrestling. So what does this all mean? All of this lawyer, legal, mumbo-jumbo, what does it all mean? Well, essentially that this whole counter filing today, or on November 1st, I should say, was essentially one of the biggest fucking beatdowns that you've ever seen in a law office setting in regards to wrestling. They completely destroyed Jeff Jarrett's credibility, his clauses, and everything related to Jeff Jarrett's original lawsuit. And I can't imagine that he is going to do anything other than retract his lawsuit at this point, if it's found that this should just be thrown out in general, which I'm, based on what I've read and based on other legal ramifications from other filings such as this, it would lead me to believe that the courts are probably just going to end up throwing this one out. If they don't, of note, there are a couple of dates that were also brought about in this. So Magistrate Judge Joe Brown said that all amended filings be done to this lawsuit be done by January 11th, 2019. So that would be any rebuttals that Jeff Jarrett would do would have to be filed before January 11th of 2019. Any discovery related to the case must be completed by July 1st of 2019, and that any other dispositive motions filed by either Impact or Jeff Jarrett need to be done by December 15th of 2019. Obviously, this is all if the case is not automatically thrown out of court after the judge sits down and reviews this entire thing, or if Jeff Jarrett does just retract his statement, which he may as well now, because honestly, he doesn't have a leg to stand on, to be honest. It looks like this thing is pretty well ironclad. Obviously, you see the lawyer background of Ed Nordholm come into play big time here. They definitely were not messing around and did their due diligence in filing all of these motions. Now, what that says to me, obviously Impact is very prepared to deal with any legal ramifications that may happen from any other carnies which try and come out of the woodwork for a quick couple of bucks, as evidenced by them also releasing every other name that they have full trademark and licensing to, as I noted at about the 10-minute mark of this program. And what it also all means is that Impact Wrestling is no joke when it comes to anybody trying to portray them as some sort of Mickey Mouse fly-by-night organization. This is a serious entity with some serious backbone and very impressive legal standings, if you will, some of which will be covered in a 6-part series I will be doing in relation to the Six-Sided Podcast. Obviously, I'm going to be doing that when my voice gets a little bit better, but I just want to take some time out tonight to go over this breaking news of the latest development of the Jeff Jarrett / Impact Wrestling saga. So suffice it to say, he won't be at Homecoming in January. However, I feel that more than likely these court proceedings will be over and done with well before then, and everybody can kind of go their own way, and might be the last time, although you never say never, but might be the last time that we hear about the carny Jeff Jarrett in Impact Wrestling in any time soon, we'll say. So with all that, thank you all for joining in tonight. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to the YouTube channel, youtube.com/c/six-sided podcast. You can also download or stream this via various streaming services, Spotify, Google Podcast, iTunes, Stitcher, basically, or Deezer as well. Anywhere that you find, steal, sort, barter, whatever, trade for your various podcasting networks. And as well, keep it locked for the next episode of the Six-Sided Podcast. Like I said, we're going to be starting a 6-part episode, kind of going over various entities and individuals in the Impact Wrestling umbrella, what they mean to the company, what they're actually doing there, kind of going a little bit on the business end of things. And I also have a couple of very special episodes that I am working in the process of right now that I'm very excited to be sharing with you all in the next coming weeks. So until then, this is the Taxman saying, for myself and what's left in my voice, because I'm still fighting this chest infection, take care of yourselves and each other. Good night, everyone.